Some Republican lawmakers in Kentucky are throwing their support behind a proposed bill that would ban sanctuary cities in that state. At the same time, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti released a Twitter video announcing his support for immigrants in the city.
This all comes amid a small number of immigration raids over the weekend, which will reportedly continue throughout the week, and a visit to several detention facilities by Vice President Mike Pence. Following his tour, the Vice President said he was proud of Customs and Border Patrol.
I have to tell you, it was very moving for me as a parent to see these families have been swept up in this crisis, but I was proud of our Customs and Border Protection, that despite what we've read in newspapers like the New York Times, and reporting that we've seen across the media, these families are receiving compassionate care in a proper environment.
Here to expand on these latest developments and how to protect immigrant rights in the midst of these actions is the Director of Government Relations for the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Previously served at the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, as well as the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. Greg Chen, great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you this morning. What happened this weekend? What do we know about these proposed raids and what actually went down?
Well, so even though the raids were projected to happen across the country in 10 major cities, all we've heard is in New York City and perhaps in Florida that there were a couple of minor enforcement actions that took place that ICE had picked up or tried to pick up families.
Why do you think that it was so much less than was advertised?
Well, it's really hard to know, and I think what's important to understand is these were projected to take place starting on Sunday, and we think it's very possible in the next several days that there will be more enforcement actions, which is why AILA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, is making sure the community has as many resources so the people who are out there know what their rights are.
Well, what are the rights, actually, of people who have been final orders of deportation? Aren't they just eligible for removal from the country?
So there's two issues here. First of all, your basic rights, if somebody comes to your home and is knocking at the door, you have the right to remain silent. You also have a right to an attorney. And if somebody's knocking on your door and says they are Immigration Customs Enforcement, they have to produce a judicially signed warrant. And if they don't do that, you don't have to open your door for them. That's important for everybody to understand. Our organization has materials, downloadable Know Your Rights information on our website. It's www.aila.org/raids. And so that's the first thing that people should just be aware of. The second thing is that even though the president is saying that these people have already had their final orders and their day in court, that's really not the case here for many of these families. Many of these families that we're talking about, extremely vulnerable individuals, didn't actually get a day in court because they were ordered removed in absentia, just Latin for absent. They weren't there. Because, first of all, the court has had many problems giving adequate notice to people of their court hearings. And the Supreme Court last June spoke to this issue and said 1 year ago, hey, you actually have to tell people where and when the court date is in order for that to be fair notice. And that wasn't happening. We actually find statistically that families show up in very high numbers if they have adequate notice. And in fact, the court data itself shows that 99% of families who have legal counsel representing them appeared at all of their court hearings.
Well, what percent of those ultimately get asylum?
I don't know the exact asylum numbers off the top of my head across the country. It's in the, I think, 20 to 40% range.
It's quite low, isn't it?
Well,
that means 60% of the families who are present in this country are not actually eligible for asylum, or are not ultimately going to get asylum.
Well, the important thing to realize there is that our asylum system is quite rigorous. And while the president is talking about using raids to pick up these families in the interior, he's not really trying to solve the problem. If he really wanted to solve the problem, what he should be doing is to improve our asylum process.
Couldn't agree
He needs to send asylum officers to the border in greater numbers. He needs to beef that process up, and he needs to improve the court system, which he is not doing. He is actually setting up rules that make it harder for the immigration judges to control their own dockets. And that's slowing courts down. That's what's frustrating him as the president, but he's actually throwing sand into the own system of his court operations.
So he also did something very unusual here, which was he announced these raids several weeks back, and then they pulled back on them, and then we found out from news reports they were supposed to go forward this weekend. I mean, did he undermine ICE's ability to do what they wanted to do here?
So it's very hard to know what ICE even had planned. What had been released in the news was that there were these major enforcement actions that were supposed to happen in 10 cities. If ICE had been preparing for major scale operations of the kind the president was talking about, I think he very much would have compromised ICE operations. I would be very frustrated if I was an ICE officer, because it takes weeks to plan that, and he's jeopardizing the operation itself, and people are not going to be at their home or may go into hiding for that purpose. And again, I think it just demonstrates that while the president wants to take credit for harsh enforcement and tough enforcement, he's actually undermining his agency's own operations by doing that.
There's speculation this week that a safe third country agreement could be signed with Guatemala. That would dramatically reduce the number of these asylum seekers who are able to make it to the United States. Have you been involved in those discussions at all, or do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the issue that has been in discussion not only with Guatemala but also with Mexico is that those countries could, if they were identified as safe third countries, be countries where asylum seekers should remain before seeking that protection in the United States. Well, the crux of this matter is safe third country, and the conditions in both Mexico and Guatemala are not safe. We have attorneys who are now ALA members who are going across the border into Mexico who themselves feel unsafe when they go there to try to identify and work with their own clients. These are people that we are hearing about, families, young children that are literally being subjected to additional sexual assault, rape in Mexico. And Guatemala is the country where these people are fleeing from. We have a serious gang problem. The highest homicide rates in the world now are in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Those cannot possibly qualify as safe third countries.
So safe to say that if they do come up with some safe third country agreement with Guatemala, that'll be subject to a number of court challenges?
I think there could be litigation that would be anticipated, and I think where the issue will really stand is, does this qualify as a safe third country under our current rules and statutes? This would be a bilateral arrangement meaning between the two governments of U.S. and Guatemala.
Something that the courts are usually hesitant to get into, right?
I think it would be something that courts would have to look at in terms of whether the United States is actually complying with our own laws. And this president has shown time and time again that he is not going to necessarily follow the U.S. law itself or international law, and that can be challenged.
Well, I think what this problem gets to is, we can try every safe third country agreement in the world, we can try this, we can pressure Mexico, all of that. The law here needs to change, right? Ultimately, what needs to change is the way that we detain families, the way that asylum seekers, we need more judges. The entire system is just such a mess. Could you just speak to that, like the actual parts of the system that are the problem here?
Yeah, so one reason that we have such a difficult situation at the border is actually because the administration itself has amped up the use of detention on these extremely vulnerable populations, asylum seekers, families, and youth themselves. And many of these people can simply be released into the community where they're told you must appear at a court date. And as I mentioned before, families appear at a very high rate for the court hearing. If you're an asylum seeker, you want that opportunity to say, hey, please protect me, come help me. And people have faith in the system if they understand how it works. But instead, we have this administration increasing detention. We are now talking about 45, 50,000 people in detention at any given time. That's a huge amount of money the American taxpayers are paying for. Instead of that, we should be looking at beefing up asylum officer ranks and corps going to the border to really screen these people properly. And we should also be looking at ensuring that the court system can operate efficiently. The courts have been underfunded traditionally compared to the enforcement operations of ICE and CBP. The courts are funded at about $400 million a year. ICE and CBP are over $20 billion. And that just means the courts can't keep up. And they need to have not only adequate funding, but that won't be enough. They need to be able to control their own dockets. And under the Department of Justice, the current court system is controlled by DOJ, and DOJ is stripping authority away from judges to act like real judges.
Right.
That's why my association is calling for the creation of an independent Article I court system that is separate from the Department of Justice, so it can operate like the kind of courts Americans understand a court should be.
We'll talk about that a little bit on the show as well. Vice President Pence visited a detention facility. We played a little clip of his interview after the fact. What did you make of his visit there?
I didn't actually get to see the full clip from when he visited. I think my general concern about either CBP short-term detention facilities and Immigration Customs Enforcement long-term facilities is the very difficult situation and inhumane conditions that families and children are being subjected to. These are people that really deserve humanitarian protection. You cannot hold them in conditions where they're locked in small cells in extremely high numbers without even adequate food, adequate hygiene, sanitation. That's just not what America stands for.
And are the detention facilities and policies fundamentally different under this president than under President Obama?
Well, what we've seen is increased ratcheting up of the use of detention and the increased detention of family members. And of course, the zero prosecution policy that was announced more than a year ago that resulted in family separation. So the separation of families, parents from their young children, toddlers, infants, there is something that simply shocks the conscience about that practice, and that is new. Under this administration.
Well, I mean, President Obama, they bragged about it, being the deporter-in-chief. Rahm Emanuel encouraged him in order to deport as many people. I did not see this level of concern in 2014. I mean, I'm sure you've been involved in this for quite some time. What do you make of that?
Well, so in 2014, when the numbers of families that were coming from Central America started spiking, and they've continued to rise since then, the President Obama at that time did increase the use of family detention. Prior to that, in fact, family detention had been scaled back significantly. And yes, that is a black scar on President Obama's record in terms of what they did there. But under this current administration, it's gotten even worse. And the use of family separation, the increased numbers has, I think, really driven this country to the lowest depth possible in terms of our standards with human rights principles and practices.
Well,
Very
thank you,
interesting. Greg, great to have your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate it. Next on Rising, ICE officials have their work cut out for them as they fan out in major cities in efforts to apprehend illegal immigrants.
Our next guest has an understanding of how specifically these operations could play out. The former acting director of ICE, John Sandweg, is going to join us next.